Hello everyone, welcome to a slightly different episode of Comic Book Breakdown. Normally, I would be going into a long-winded explanation of whatever new series I was going to be breaking down, but this time you get a long-winded explanation about Breakdown Biographies, my Patreon-exclusive show. I've mentioned in the main feed before that my wife and I are hoping to start a family soon, and that costs money, so I'm hoping to use the podcast to support us, at least to some degree. To that end, I have launched a Patreon for the show, and if you subscribe at the $5 a month tier, then you will get access to a bi-monthly episode called Breakdown Biographies, and each episode will feature a different comic book creator. This was originally planned to be a monthly show, but as I juggle my paying job with Breakdown and now Biographies with Breakdown on top of that, I've learned that a monthly spin-off just doesn't seem viable. I'm still going to be producing these episodes as fast as I can, and if a monthly schedule is viable, then that is absolutely what I'm going to go with. I would really like to stick to that kind of schedule. I just also don't want to say that I'm going to hit a monthly schedule if I can't. So for now, I'm going to say we're going bi-monthly. If Breakdown Biographies sounds like something that you are interested in, I will have links to the Patreon in the description of this very podcast episode. I already have a few episodes up, and I figured that I would give you, dear audience listener, a taste of what you are missing. So, I hope you enjoy. If you, dear listener, were to walk into a crowded sidewalk and ask a random passerby to name a famous comic book figure, there's really only one answer that I would honestly expect. Stan Lee. You might, maybe, get Kevin Smith or Robert Kirkman. They have a lot of pop culture credit to get a good mention. But Stan Lee has almost transcended the job of comic book writer, or editor, or art director, or publisher. He is almost synonymous with Marvel Comics or their movies these days. However, that wasn't always what Stan wanted. Sure, Lee dreamed of making it as a writer, but not as a writer of comic books. So how did he end up getting to that point? How did he get to a point where saying the name Stan Lee almost immediately makes people think of not just comics, but some of the most famous and well-recognized comic book figures in the world? Let's break it down. Welcome to Breakdown Biographies. Stanley Lieber was born on December 28, 1922, to his Romanian-born Jewish parents. In October 26 of 1931, his younger brother, Lawrence, was born. This meant that the Lieber family was alive during the Great Depression, which lasted from 1929 until the 1930s. Lee's father, Jack, was chained as a dress cutter or tailor and worked, but only from time to time. The Lee brothers shared the single bedroom in their apartment while his parents slept on a fold-out couch. This must have had an impact on Lee, who grew up reading. Lee read everything that he could, including works by Mark Twain, Jules Verne, the Hardy Boys, Tarzan, Tom Swift, Edgar Allan Poe, Arthur Conan Doyle, Victor Hugo, Charles Dickens, H.G. Wells, and, of course, Shakespeare. According to Lee, his mother loved to watch him read aloud. The financial situation put a strain on the family as Jack Lieber struggled to work. Life wasn't great, but it wasn't terrible either. The family would get together on Sunday nights and listen to the radio, absorbing programs like Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy, comedian Jack Benny, and Chandu the Magician. When his parents somehow managed to buy him a bike, Lee had the freedom to go where he pleased in 1930s New York, which meant the movie theater. It's clear that young Lee's life was filled with adventure, but mostly in his mind. An investment which would eventually pay off. However, the monetary problems meant that Lee started working fairly young. He did part-time work like writing obituaries for famous people who were still alive, and did press releases for the National Tuberculosis Center. He delivered sandwiches for the Jack May Pharmacy, worked as an office boy, the old-school equivalent of an intern, it sounds like, for a trouser manufacturer. He did ushering at the Rivoli Theater, where he met Eleanor Roosevelt on one night. The First Lady and 4 agents of the Secret Service chose to sit in Lee's particular theater, but he tripped over a foot that was sticking out in the aisle, and Mrs. Roosevelt helped him up. How about that? Anyway, Lee also sold subscriptions to the New York Herald Tribune newspaper. Money was in short supply, and Lee did what he could to make a buck. Despite all of those jobs, Lee wasn't aspiring to be a writer at the time. That didn't happen until he entered a high school essay competition at age 15 for the New York Herald Tribune. According to Lee, he won the contest 3 weeks straight, so they eventually contacted him and told him to let someone else win. They also suggested that Lee look into writing professionally and, according to him, taken from the book Stan Lee, the Man Behind Marvel, this suggestion changed his life. In 1939, at only 16 and a half years old, Lee graduated from DeWitt Clinton High School in the Bronx and joined the WPA Federal Theater Project. The WPA-FTP was a program established in the Great Depression to help fund live artistic and entertainment performances in order to employ artists, writers, directors, and theater workers. Within a year of its creation, the FTP employed 15,000 men and women, paying them $23.86 a week, which was no small amount in the 1930s. But the purpose of the FTP was to employ and train people, not to make money, so not only did the FTP cost $46 million, but it made nothing. To be fair, the point of the FTP wasn't to make money, it was to employ Americans in a field that they were skilled in and cared about, allowing them to survive this grim period of history with some dignity and self-respect. About 64% of the FTP's productions were presented to an audience free of charge. And this was at a time when a movie would cost 25 cents, while a nice commercial theater charged from $1.10 to $2.20 to cover their costs. The FTP eventually ended in 1938, but it was the beginning for notable theater artists like Arthur Miller, Orson Welles, and, although I couldn't find any details on his time there, a teenage Stanley Lieber. 1939 was a big year for Lee for another reason. His uncle, Robbie Solomon, helped Lee become an assistant at Timely Comics. Timely Comics is the publishing entity that would, eventually, evolve into Marvel Comics. At the time, though, Lee wasn't writing. It would be years before he even got the chance. Instead, Lee did work like getting people's lunch, proofreading articles, or erasing pencils from the finished pages. All of it for $8 a week. Adjusted for inflation, if I'm using this digital calculator right, Lee was making the 2020 equivalent of $148 a week. In 1941, Lee finally became a published author working on Captain America issue 3 under his pen name Stan Lee. It was a 2-page story, text only, called Captain America Foils the Traitor's Revenge. Hang on, let me try that again. Called Captain America Foils the Traitor's Revenge. You see, comic books had such a social stigma attached to them at the time that Lee didn't want his actual name, Stanley Lieber, on his work. It was still his dream to write the great American novel, and he would need his good name intact for that. So he split his first name in half. Stanley became Stan Lee. This is also the issue where Cap's ricocheting shield throw debuted, so it's kind of a bit of a thing. Stan would continue to write for Timely in a backup feature called Headline Hunter, Foreign Correspondent, which I had never heard of. Jerry Headline Hunter, yeah, his last name is Hunter, I love this stuff, was a reporter for the Associated Press. He was sent to Britain at the start of World War II, but was having trouble finding stories initially. Over time, though, he would find himself better and better stories, becoming involved in them himself. This concept, to me, is quintessential Stan Lee at Marvel. While we haven't gotten into it yet, Marvel would become known for creating realistic characters with problems and personal lives, as opposed to the staunch, kind of stiff stalwarts that DC would deliver on. And here, with Headline Hunter, we have a regular guy who finds himself just trying to do his job, and is being put in a position to do more to aid the war effort. How much more, with great power comes great responsibility, can you get? Well, a lot more, I guess, but this is a good place to start. Lee would continue to create new characters, like the Nazi-fighting Destroyer, with artists Jack Binder, who drew the issue, and Alex Schomburg, who drew the cover, as well as Jack Frost and Father Time, although they were to prove to be less popular than the Destroyer. After only a few months at Timely Comics, Lee lucked out. Timely's editor, Joe Simon, and his creative partner, Jack Kirby, left the company in late 1941 after having a problem with Martin Goodman, who owned Timely. Seems that Simon and Kirby were doing work on the side for national periodicals, the company that, at the time, was Timely's biggest rival and, shockingly, published stories featuring Superman and Batman. Since Lee had proven to have a knack for making comics, Goodman installed Lee as the new editor-in-chief and art director of Timely, a position that he would hold until 1972. That wasn't all that Lee did, though. In the early part of 1942, Lee enlisted in the United States Army, feeling that he could do no less. Lee didn't see combat, though. He was first stationed at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, where he stood guard over the Atlantic Ocean. Eventually, he was transferred to the Training Film Division, which is where he wrote manuals, training film, slogans, and did some cartoons. According to Lee, his military classification was playwright, which only 9 other men in the U.S. Army ever held. Lee worked with other writers like William Saroyan, Charles Addams, whose cartoons would become known as the Addams Family, future director Frank Capra, Theodore Geisel, who would go on to become Dr. Seuss, and the guys who would go on to create Charlie's Angels, Ben Roberts, and Ivan Goff. Wow! Don't you think that being part of the Army would keep Lee too busy to make comics, though? Well, only partially. The editor of Timely's Animation Comics section, which produced material akin to what we know as comic strips today, was a man named Vincent Fago, and he filled in for Lee while he served with the military. Even then, Lee kept working. He would get letters from the editors at Timely every Friday, which would tell him what needed to be written and by when. Lee would write whatever he had to and then mail the story back on Monday. One week, though, the mail clerk missed his letter and told Lee that he had no mail. This was strange to Lee, who visited the closed mailroom the next day and saw a letter with Timely's return address on it. Lee went to the officer in charge to see if he would open the mailroom, but the officer refused. Unwilling to miss his deadline, Lee got a screwdriver and took the door off its hinges. Naturally, the mailroom officer didn't take this well. He turned Lee into the base captain, and so he faced tampering charges, which could have landed him in Leavenworth Prison. But the colonel in charge of the finance department stepped in and saved Lee from that punishment. Lee was then soon chosen for a new mission. It seems that the enlisted men overseas were not practicing safe sex, and so there was an outbreak of syphilis. The Army needed to do something to counteract this. They needed a way to remind the men to use the prophylactic stations that the Army had set up. And Stan Lieber was the man for the job. His cartoon of an American soldier standing before a sign that read, Pro Station, with an attractive lady waiting next to it saying, VD, not me, was printed up and spread all over Europe. Lee's military service ended in 1945, allowing him to return to Timely Comics full-time. He stayed at the Almanac Hotel and started writing, doing so steadily until 1947. A few days shy of his 25th birthday, a friend set Lee up on a blind date with a model, and after Lee knocked on the door and she opened it, he was immediately smitten. This was Joan Bucock from Newcastle upon Tyne, England. Lee asked her out on the spot, and actually never saw the woman that he was supposed to meet. The pair dated for a time, and eventually they knew that it was time to get married. But there's a catch. Joan was already married. Oh, she had been planning to get a divorce anyway, but dating Lee had solidified the need to do it. So Joan had moved to Reno, where an applicant would only have to wait 6 weeks for the paperwork to get processed. While Stan was still in New York, working and waiting, Joan was in Reno, surrounded by handsome, rugged men. A letter that she sent to Stan galvanized him, because it opened with Dear Jack instead of Dear Stan. Well, that wasn't going to stand. Lee booked it to the airport, got on the first flight to Reno, which made 3 stops along the way, and 28 hours later, Lee made it. He met up with Joan, they visited the divorce office and made that official, then they went one door over and were married by the same judge who had done Joan's divorce. The pair married, and the couple bought a house in 1949. Fun fact, Joan cut Stan's hair his entire adult life. Lee wrote all kinds of comics during this time for Atlas Comics, the name that Timely was now publishing with. He wrote romance, western, sci-fi, medieval fantasy, horror comics, suspense. You name it, Lee wrote it. He even launched a newspaper comic strip based on a radio comedy with fellow comic guy Dan DiCarlo. But none of it was satisfying to Lee, and by the end of 1950, Lee had considered quitting comics altogether. It wasn't all bad, though, as Lee's first child, a girl named Joan Celia J.C. Lee, was born in April of 1950. Joan after Lee's wife, and Celia after his mother. In 1953, the Lees had a second daughter, Jan, but she died 3 days after being born. The loss hit the parents bad, especially Joan. Unfortunately, after that, Joan was unable to have any more children, and while the Lees did try to adopt, the whole process was just too painful. However, at the time, Lee had a new little girl to take care of and work to do. Marvel Comics' future was looking good, saved, ironically enough, by DC Comics. In the late 1950s, then-editor Julius Schwartz had brought back the idea of superheroes. He had revamped the Flash concept, which eventually led to the creation of the Justice League of America. If superheroes were the order of the day, then Marvel Comics, as Timely turned Atlas was now known, needed their own. Publisher Martin Goodman assigned Lee to the idea, and he needed to create a brand new superhero team. But Lee was not sold on this idea. He was burned out on comics and was toying with the idea of quitting in order to write novels. So his wife Joan suggested that he go balls to the wall, although I'm sure that she didn't say it in that crass way. If Lee was going to quit comics anyways, then she suggested that he write whatever he wanted to write, even if he thought that Goodman wouldn't like it, or if it would be popular, or sell, or anything. If Lee lost his job, well, he wanted a new one anyway, right? So Lee created a group of superheroes that had flaws and humanity, that felt realistic, natural, and could have tempers, that could be sad, or fight with each other, or worry about bills, or girlfriends, or get sick. It has long been said that the major difference between Marvel and DC is a simple phrase. Marvel published comics about people, while DC published comics about gods. That humanity really started here. Along with artist Jack Kirby, the Fantastic Four were created in 1961. Now, I won't lie, there is a ton of debate over how much credit actually goes to Stan Lee or Jack Kirby over the creation of the Fantastic Four. Lee was famous for writing in a style that would come to be known as Marvel style. Basically, Lee would give an artist a prompt, a synopsis, or have a conversation with them about a general idea for an issue. Something like, a threat comes from outer space, and the Fantastic Four have to stop it, but they don't know how, so they find an unexpected ally and team up to stop it. The artist would then draw, and basically plot the comic, making it up as they drew it. Once the pages were turned in, Lee, as editor-in-chief and art director and writer, would then write whatever he wanted over the pages. How much of the Fantastic Four and their subsequent creations was Lee's, and how much of it was Kirby's? Well, it's hard to tell. Kirby leaned heavily on his designs from DC's Challengers of the Fantastic for the costume designs of the Fantastic Four, but it was Lee who added to the four of the chest of their uniforms, and ultimately it was Lee who voiced the characters. Lee and Kirby went on to produce 102 issues of the Fantastic Four until Kirby left the company in the mid-1970s. But before that happened, the Fantastic Four comics were selling. Lee began to print letters from fans in issue number 3, which is also where they added the tagline, "The World's Greatest Comic Magazine." That slogan has changed over the years and would come and go from the covers of Marvel's first superhero comic, but to Lee, this was really the book that changed it all. Lee and Kirby would go on to co-create some of comics' most beloved characters, like Iron Man, Hulk, Thor, and the X-Men. Lee would team with Bill Everett to co-create Daredevil and Steve Ditko to create Spider-Man. Not content to just pump out solo book after solo book, though, Lee and Kirby created a new team of heroes, the Avengers, and populated it with previously created characters. They would also eventually bring back Namor the Submariner and Captain America, both of whom were originally created for Timely Comics. What kind of stories were being told isn't the only thing that Lee changed. He also revamped how Marvel Comics interacted with its fan base. It was Lee who introduced the credits panel, introducing readers to the creative team behind the book, often with cute nicknames like Smiling Stan Lee or Jumping Jack Kirby. Lee introduced an editorial page called the Bullpen Bulletins, which featured news about the Marvel staff members, like when someone got engaged or had a kid or was joining a book. The Bullpen Bulletins also teased upcoming stories or characters, which was also a clever way of getting someone who showed up to read a book to also get that person to know the creative team behind it. In 1965, Lee created the Merry Marvel Marching Society, known as the MMMS, which fans could join for $1, and they would receive a bevy of society-only goodies. In an era when contact with comic creators was so limited, this sounds amazing to me. Remember, there was no internet, no Twitter, no message boards, or personal websites to interact with comic creators like there are these days. I'm honestly not even sure if comic conventions were a thing back in the 60s, and if they were, I don't know if Marvel or DC had anything to do with them. They may have just been a fan-run event. Having a company like Marvel acknowledge that you read their books and sent you things like a membership card or a welcoming letter or an official certificate sounds so cool. In 1971, Lee accidentally helped to reform the Comics Code by ignoring it. The Comics Code Authority was created back in 1954 as an alternative to the government stepping in to regulate and control the content of comic book stories. Remember, comics were more than just superhero stories back then. They were westerns, science fiction stories, romance comics, and horror comics. There was some widespread concern over how gory and horrific the depictions in comic books could be, which led to the creation of the Comics Code. The code was an attempt to make sure that comic books provided good, upstanding moral examples to the youth of America. It was totally voluntary, and there was no law saying that a comic had to be code compliant. It was just a way to keep the damning eye of the outraged public off of the comic industry's back. Well, the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare asked Stan Lee to write a story about the dangers of drugs. Always willing to be a good example, Lee wrote a story in which Peter Parker's best friend became addicted to prescription drugs. However, the depiction of drugs caused the Comics Code Authority to refuse to put their seal on the comics, even if the depiction of drugs was a negative one. Yes, there were drugs in the story, and that was all that they cared about. Martin Goodman, still the publisher of Marvel Comics at the time, was confident in the story, though, and in Lee, and the government asked for this story after all. So Marvel published the comics anyways, without the code's seal of approval. The comics sold great, duh, and Marvel got some good press for its socially conscious efforts. This caused the CCA to loosen its print rules to include the positive depictions of drugs, as well as a number of other things. Goes to show you the power of a good story. This wasn't the only case of Lee doing his best to provide a good example, though. Another staple of Marvel's comics was Stan's Soapbox, an editorial column that Lee wrote each month in which he commented on a social issue. Being Stan, he certainly worked in some promotion of upcoming comics or storylines, but he also spoke about bigotry, racism, and prejudice. Lee would finish each soapbox with his now famous catchphrase, Excelsior. But why Excelsior? Well, Lee wrote a lot for Marvel, and not just the comics. He wrote tons of press articles, lots of ads and promotional copy, and was kind of famous for his flashy, catchy ways of doing it. Lee knew he needed to get people's attention first, and that whenever he said had to be short and memorable. So Lee would use phrases like face front true believer, hang loose, or, a personal fave, nuff said. However, these phrases were so useful that the distinguished competition, which was Stan Lee speak for DC, was often trying to imitate or copy them. Lee wanted something that no one would copy, so he picked a word that, he hoped, no one knew the meaning of and that no one else could spell. He picked Excelsior. When I was a kid, I read somewhere that Excelsior meant wood shavings, but apparently that's not actually right. Excelsior comes from the Latin exclamation excelsus, the ex meaning out or beyond, and the celsus meaning lofty. Excelsior then means something along the lines of ever upward. Lee's interactions with the fans through the letter pages birthed another Marvel staple. In one of the letter pages, Stan challenged the fans to prove that Namor was a mutant. In his challenge, Lee outright stated that there were no prizes, and since there were no prizes, no one could win, and everyone was right. But as Lee's secretary, Flo Steinberg, informed him, the fans wanted some kind of prize anyways. So, okay, we will give them no prize, Lee suggested. Marvel would send fans an envelope marked on the outside with a notice saying that the fan had won a no prize, and the envelope would be empty. Lee's idea here was to remind fans that comics should be fun, something that you read because you enjoyed it, not because you could win a prize by explaining away some error. Apparently, some fans wrote back after receiving their no prize, stating that it must have fallen out in transit. In 1972, he stopped writing comics to assume the duties of publisher for Marvel Comics, and kind of became the face of the company for a while. He made appearances at comic conventions and at college lectures. In 1977, Lee and artist John Romita Sr. launched the Spider-Man newspaper comic strip, which ran until its cancellation in 2019, after Lee's death. To give credit where it's due, author Roy Thomas ghost wrote the strip since 2000, though. 1978 saw the publication of Marvel's first graphic novel, with The Silver Surfer, The Ultimate Cosmic Experience, in which Lee teamed up one last time with artist Jack Kirby. Then in 1981, Lee and his family moved to California, the plan being to develop Marvel's TV and movie properties. They weren't alone in their new home, however. It seems that the previous owner had rented the guest house out before selling the property to them, and had informed no one of this decision. The Lees had to get lawyers involved to get their unwanted tenant off of their property. Otherwise, Lee set up a studio for Marvel to develop their new properties out of, and filled it with interviews and lectures that he had done over the years. Lee even had a bust of his wife, Joan, there. But the studio burned down one night, and signaled the troubles that Lee would end up having in Hollywood. Now, Marvel had done some live-action work before, with the Incredible Hulk and Spider-Man TV shows. But both of those shows were cancelled, Hulk in '82 and Spider-Man in '79. Marvel would produce a Doctor Strange pilot, 2 Captain America movies, and they would introduce Thor in The Incredible Hulk Returns in 1988, and Daredevil in 1989's The Trial of the Incredible Hulk. Marvel knew that it had some amazing characters with some amazing stories, but the world of film and special effects hadn't quite caught up yet. I mean, just look at 1986's release of Howard the Duck. Yeah, it's a cult classic now, but it was not exactly a box office smash back then. Marvel also produced a film for The Punisher, but that saw a limited release. This foray into film was not to be Marvel's best, but Lee kept trying. He still wrote comics occasionally, and was even the president of Marvel Comics for a time, but eventually stepped down. The role of president was too much about numbers and sales, and Lee was a creator at heart. He wanted to tell stories, not worry about the budget. The 1990s saw Stan move away from regular work at Marvel. He was still a beloved figure at the company, and did work on Spider-Man the Animated Series, both as a narrator and as a producer. To be fair, Lee was only involved in the production of Season 1 of the show, which would ultimately go on to run for 5 seasons. In 1998, Lee and Peter Paul, a former lawyer and entrepreneur, founded Stan Lee Media. The idea was to create a new, internet-based studio which could create, market, and produce new superheroes. However, in 2000, investigators found that Paul and a corporate officer were manipulating the company's stock. The company filed for bankruptcy in 2001, and Paul eventually pleaded guilty to the stock scheme. Lee was not implicated in any of the shady goings-ons. 2001 then saw Lee team with Gil Champion and Arthur Lieberman to create POW Entertainment. The POW stands for Purveyors of Wonder, by the way, which I did not know. The point here was to create film, TV, and video game properties, like the movies Stan Lee's Lightspeed, the TV show Who Wants to Be a Superhero, as well as the direct-to-DVD movies Stan Lee's Mosaic, which I remember coming out when I worked at Target. I put that DVD on the shelves, as well as Stan Lee Presents The Condor. Perhaps the most infamous creation of POW was Spike TV's Stripperella cartoon, which ran for a total of 13 episodes. 2001 also saw the release, I love this, of Just Imagine, a line of comics published by DC in which Stan Lee reimagined DC's biggest names. These books are the first books that Lee ever wrote for DC, which kind of boggles my mind. Comic book creators moving from Marvel to DC and vice versa was pretty common. Jack Kirby himself worked for DC, then for Marvel, then for DC, kind of as it suited him. Naturally, being in a leadership position at Marvel allowed Lee a huge amount of creative freedom, working with characters and ideas that not only had he created, but that he had helped to shape over the years. I can totally get why he wouldn't bother going to write for DC for 60 years. But eventually he did, and he brought his own Stan Lee style to the books, including alliterative names like Wayne Williams for Batman or Maria Mendoza for Wonder Woman. DC published 13 comics in total. They're pretty uneven quality-wise, but they show that even after decades in the industry, Lee was willing to try new, fun ideas and to still tell stories. The Just Imagine line is a lot of fun, if very weird. I'll have to talk about it on Breakdown someday. 2002 saw Lee sue Marvel after the success of Fox's X-Men movie and Sony's Spider-Man film. Despite having co-created the characters, Lee did not own the rights to any of them. His job was to create characters and stories for Marvel, who then owned and could publish what they saw fit. However, in the 1990s, Marvel had promised Lee 10% of any future profits. Their previous film and television shows didn't do very well, so, how much money could they end up making, right? Well, X-Men alone grossed over $400 million by August of 2002, after only 4 months in theaters. Lee and Marvel settled in 2005 for an undisclosed 7-figure amount. Legal issues would follow Stan, and in 2007, a super confusing round of lawsuits were filed. I won't claim to understand them, and I can't seem to find any good resolution to those lawsuits, so I'm not sure what happened. One of the suits claimed that Lee had given his rights to several Marvel characters to the Stan Lee Media Company in exchange for stock in the company and a salary, but I find that unlikely, as Stan didn't own the rights to any Marvel characters. 2008 saw POW Entertainment teaming with mangaka Hiroyuki Takei, the creator of the manga and anime Shaman King. They created Karakuri Doji Ultimo, which ran for 12 volumes in Japan. POW would go on to collaborate with the anime studio Bones to create Hero Man, which ran for 5 volumes and got a 26-episode anime, so not a bad job there. Good for you, Stan. In 2010, Stan Lee and POW Entertainment teamed up with the comics publisher Boom Studios. Yeah, all caps with an exclamation point, to launch 3 new superheroes for the company. Boom had made a name for itself publishing independent titles before getting into the game of publishing comic books based on licensed properties, like Warhammer 4K, The Muppet Show, or Pixar-based comics. In 2007, Boom hired author Mark Waid as their editor-in-chief, and he would eventually become their chief creative officer. Boom wanted to get into the superhero game, and so they reached out to POW. After all, who better to create new superheroes for them than the guy who took superheroes to a whole new level? Boom launched 3 titles with characters that Lee helped to shape, although he didn't write the books themselves. These were Soldier Zero, Traveler, and Starborn, all of which would run for 12 issues before ultimately being cancelled. Lee would continue to write and create for a number of different publishers and producers on a number of different fronts, developing books, movies, TV shows, comics, and NFL mascots. His most famous work since the 2000s, though, is perhaps his cameo appearances in the various Marvel movies that have come out since. To be fair, cameos are kind of a thing of Stan's. He appeared in a panel of 1943's Terry Toons issue 12 as third assistant office boy, as well as a number of other comics over the years. Lee, Kirby, production executive Saul Brodsky, and secretary Flo Steinberg even became superheroes themselves in 1978's What If issue 11, titled What If the Marvel Bullpen Had Become the Fantastic Four? Lee, of course, was Mr. Fantastic. Lee was the narrative device for Marvel's flashback single issues in 1997, used to introduce the concept of the comic before the story started. In 2006, Marvel celebrated Lee's 65 years with them by releasing a series of one-shots that featured Lee meeting some of his creations, including Spider-Man, Doctor Strange, The Thing, the Silver Surfer, and Doctor Doom. Lee even served as the facial model for the cover of Black Rider issue 8, which was published in 1950. Lee's first film cameo was in 1989's The Trial of the Incredible Hulk, where he was the jury foreman in the trial of Dr. David Bruce Banner. Lee would go on to cameo in the Sony Spider-Man films, the Fox X-Men films, and all of the Marvel Studio movies. He's appeared in the Ultimate Spider-Man animated series, he voiced the mayor of Superhero City in the Superhero Squad cartoon, and was Fred's father in Disney Pixar's Big Hero 6. Over the years, Lee has appeared in films outside of Marvel too, like Kevin Smith's Mallrats and The Princess Diaries, where he got to hit on Julie Andrews, and even appeared on The Big Bang Theory. As Lee got older, though, he did suffer health complications. In 2012, he had a pacemaker inserted. 2017 was a rough year for Stan, as not only was his eyesight deteriorating, but he also suffered through the loss of his wife, Joan, who died of complications from a stroke at age 95. This caused some new problems with POW Entertainment, which was being acquired by Samsung International, a Chinese company. POW's CEO Shane Duffy and co-founder Gil Champion presented Lee with paperwork that he told was a non-exclusive license for POW, under Samsung, to use his likeness and intellectual property. However, this was an exclusive license, and Lee stated that he would never have signed a deal like that if he had been informed of what it was beforehand. This led to POW taking over Lee's social media accounts, and, according to him, they impersonated him. POW stated that Lee and his daughter, JC, were aware of the terms that he signed, and in 2018, the lawsuit ended up being dropped. However, in April of 2018, Lee's former business manager, Gerardo Olivares, had a complaint filed against him by Lee. Lee's complaint stated that, after getting power of attorney, Olivares fired Lee's personal banker, convinced him to transfer millions of dollars from his accounts, some of which Olivares used to buy a condo, and made changes to Lee's will. Lee's new business manager, Kia Morgan, was accused of isolating Lee from his friends and family after the death of his wife, Joan, with the goal of gaining access to Lee's wealth, then estimated to be around $50 million. A restraining order was issued against Morgan that August, and in May of 2019, the Los Angeles Superior Court charged Morgan with 5 counts of abuse, including false imprisonment, grand theft of an elder, fraud, forgery, and a charge of elder abuse. As amazing as a storyteller as Lee was, finances and legal issues had never been his strong suit. On November 12th, 2018, Stan Lee died at age 95. The official cause of death was cardiac arrest with respiratory failure and congestive heart failure. Lee's body was cremated and given to his daughter, JC. To say that Stan Lee has had an impact on my life would be an incredible understatement. I can honestly say that I would not be the person that I am today if it wasn't for the work of Stan. I've been trying to write the ending to this Stan Lee biography for roughly around a month to 2 months now. Technically, I've been writing it for about a month active time. I've been writing it for about 2 months passive time, where I've just kind of had it in the back of my head, and I've been thinking about what I wanted to say. And every time I've sat down and tried to write it, I feel like I've been saying good points, but I also feel like I've been failing to kind of capture how important Stan Lee was. And I don't mean to the comic book industry, I mean to me personally. I feel like the biography you just listened to does hopefully a really good job of kind of telling you how important Stan was to the world of comic books. And he was absolutely a legendary figure. I've tried to make sure to include the points that were kind of his negatives, that were the downside. I am not and have never said that Stan Lee's perfect, or that the way that he handled all of his roles or jobs in the comic book industry were perfect. There were some things where the system existed and there wasn't anything he could do about it. There's some things where maybe Stan probably didn't even know that there was a problem. One of the biographies that I read to create this condensed biography really kind of conveyed that Stan didn't quite understand why artists like Jack Kirby or Steve Ditko were kind of annoyed with him towards the end of their careers, why they didn't talk to him anymore or want to work with him anymore. And there's a part of me that immediately wants to defend Stan. What research that I have done on figures like Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko leads me to believe that they were fairly withdrawn people. Like a lot of artists, they like to be left alone and they don't want to be in the spotlight very often, which isn't to say that they were antisocial or that they hated people. It's just they didn't fall into that role comfortably, where I really do feel like that was a much more natural fit for Stan. There was a recent issue of The Immortal Hulk. I say recent issue, the book's been published for over a year now. Somewhere within The Immortal Hulk's recent life, author Al Ewing, if I remember correctly, described Stan as one part used car salesman and one part everybody's favorite grandpa. And I kind of feel like that's perfect. There's a charm to Stan. It feels like reading these biographies that there always was. He always had a way with words. He was a salesman at his heart, I feel like. He was an excellent writer, but that writerness was also hidden under a very competent understanding of what it took to sell something and how to make something interesting, how to make people want to buy your product. And so it does seem like there was definitely a lot of Stan kind of naturally fell into the spotlight with these books that he was writing and these interviews that he was doing and these trips that he went on, where these other figures did not do that, either because they didn't want to, or because they weren't asked to, or because, honestly, Stan didn't consider how they felt. That's totally possible. And that's something that I wanted to make sure that I conveyed within this biography. But that said, I have an inordinate amount of love for Stan Lee, for somebody that I've never met or interacted with. I did have some vague opportunities to meet him. I've been to MegaCon a couple times, and I think Stan went to it a couple years, but it was always like, it's $100, and literally all you get to do is like see him, and then you have to leave, and that never seemed important to me, partially because I never went to MegaCon with having $100 on me. That was a scientific impossibility for most of the time. The 2 times that I have gone to MegaCon, somebody else paid for my ticket or invited me along, so I was very thankful just to be there, to be quite honest. And it never seemed important to me to spend $100 just to see what amounts to be an old man.
Even if he was such a legendary figure in the world of comic books, he's still just a dude. Like, that's kind of the thing when you meet most comic book creators, is they're just people. And that's true of anybody, any kind of celebrity or anything like that. But there's also a certain pedestal that they get put on. And again, especially someone like Stan, who created these amazing figures, and he's such a legendary figure who had this huge impact. And there's a certain amount of respect there, which is amazing, but he's still just a guy. And that's always something that I've been aware of. And then, when he died, it hit me. And I knew it was going to hit me. I follow comic book news pretty readily. I check multiple news sites every day. And so as Stan Lee became less and less involved with conventions, and he became less and less involved with making the cameos for the Marvel Cinematic Universe movies, and as he got older, it became very clear to me that the time was coming when he was going to pass. Whether that was in a year or 5 years or 10 years, impossible to know, but it was coming. And so I had begun to kind of mentally prepare myself for that. And when he died, I let myself mourn. I do not think that sadness is an inherently bad thing, and I don't think there's anything wrong with missing somebody who's gone for any reason. Whenever you feel like. It happens. It hits us. Death is a natural part of the human experience. It is not something that should be denied. It is something that should be appreciated. It is something that should be a chance to reflect on the things that matter to you, because knowing that these things are going to end makes them that much more important. And after Stan died, I let myself be sad, and I let myself cry, and take time to just feel it, you know? And that was really the thing that kind of hit home how important Stan was. Like, out of all the people in my life that have died, the death of Stan Lee is something that hit me so intensely. And a large part of that has to do with, my love of comics, but why do I love comics? And I love comics because so much of what I view as the positive aspects of my personality came from or were nurtured by comic books. A lot of my morality, a lot of how I view the world and try to interact with people is shaped by the lessons that these comic books taught me. You know, the X-Men taught me not to fear and hate people just because they're different, to try and see past those differences, to interact with them on an individual level, because really, we're all individuals, and we all need to be treated and interacted with based upon that. You know, Spider-Man taught me, of course, that classic lesson, with great power comes great responsibility. And what Stan was saying there wasn't that if you get bit by a spider and you get superpowers, you should become a superhero. What Stan was saying was that if you have the power to do something that can help another person, you have a responsibility to help that person. You have to help them. Not because you're legally obligated to, not because you'll go to hell if you don't, not because there's some kind of cosmic judge sitting there watching your actions, deciding whether or not you're a good person or a bad person, but because you have to, on a moral level. That's what it means to be a good person. And then taking that a step further, looking at all of the Spider-Man stories that I've read, almost every time Peter Parker has done that kind of thing, it has cost him. Whether that's fame, fortune, a person that he loves, his reputation, his job. We as people need to make good decisions that help other people, even if it's going to cost us personally. And that's an incredibly hard thing to do. I will never say that it's not, and I won't say that I have exemplified that throughout my life. But I have tried. And every time that I've failed, I've heard Stan's voice in the back of my head, just being like, you know, it's okay to fail. Like, you tried. You did better than you did last time, and that's what's important. Keep at it. You know, the Fantastic Four are so much of, you know, you look at modern films like the Guardians of the Galaxy, or to some degree the X-Men films, or to some degree the Avengers movies, and they're all about these strange families. They're about these strange people choosing their family. that the family you were born into isn't necessarily your only family. And I love my blood family. They're great people, and I love them. And that wasn't ever anything that really stood out to me, but really, that was what the Fantastic Four was. They were the original family of weirdos, in my opinion. You know, Mr. Fantastic and Sue were dating. Ben is basically Mr. Fantastic's, like, brother, as far as I'm concerned, from an emotional standpoint. A lot of people consider Johnny and Ben to be, like, the kids of the Fantastic Four, and to a certain degree I can see that. But the relationship, the main relationship there for Benjamin J. Grimm is with Reed Richards. And Fantastic Four showed me that family isn't who you're born with, it's who you choose to be with, and to explore, and to be wondrous, and to appreciate the world around you. You know, there's so many interesting characters and concepts and ideas in Marvel's comics, and the best characters and concepts have always been things that are bigger than themselves. And they're things that have always affected us more on a personal level than on a day-to-day life level. And I'm not discounting any of the work that authors have done with those characters since Stan created them. Dan Slott's run on Silver Surfer over the past couple of years was amazing. Chris Claremont really, even more than Stan Lee, defined what the X-Men are. And you can find so many good runs by so many creators on all of these different characters and books, but really that core idea, that main kind of noble sentiment, came from Stan Lee and his co-creators. And so there's a decent part of me that kind of feels like I was raised by Stan Lee. And then there's also the part of me that knows every interaction that I had with Stan was a planned, proposed, written, scripted interaction. You know, again, thinking about Stan narrating Spider-Man the Animated Series, or X-Men, I'm forgetting the name of the VHS tape one now, Pride of the X-Men, animated movie, or interviews that I've read with him, or interviews that I've seen with him. All of those things are very scripted, and they're all very Stan putting on that kind of showmanship air. And it's a very affable air. He wants you to like him. He wants you to want his product. And that's amazing. And it's endearing because he does it so well, and it feels so natural. Whether that's who Stan really was, I don't know. I'll never get to say, because I never met him. But it always felt so real. Like, it's almost more the idea that I love and appreciate the idea of Stan Lee almost more than the actual man. And that kind of frustrates me a little bit too, just with myself. But yeah, I don't know what else to say. There's, when I did my mourning for Stan, like I said, I let myself be sad, I let myself cry, I let myself have the time to do that. And then months later, my wife and I went to see Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. And I wasn't going into it expecting a lot. It's a Sony Spider-Man film. It looked amazing, and that was the thing that kind of had sold me on it. Was visually, this film was unlike anything else I'd ever seen. And so we're watching the movie, and if you haven't seen Into the Spider-Verse, spoiler alert, there's going to be some stuff coming up that's going to ruin some of the stuff in the movie. But in the movie, Miles Morales meets a Peter Parker. That Peter Parker dies. Spider-Man dies relatively early into the start of the movie, and then Miles is starting to come up with the idea that maybe he needs to be Spider-Man. And he begins putting together like a costume. And he goes to a costume shop. And it turns out the guy who owns the shop is basically motherfucking Stan Lee. And the first thing, without even seeing that it's Stan yet, that we hear him say is, "I miss him." And then Miles turns around and we see that it's Stan. And it was everything that I had felt for Stan Lee on screen, captured visually. Like, it looks like Stan Lee. It's a perfect 3D representation being said by the man himself. And I immediately teared up. Couldn't help it. Stan goes on to talk to Miles about how the things that Spider-Man stood for were bigger than him, and that while the Spider-Man costume might not fit Miles now, eventually it will. You grow into something like that. You don't immediately start as Spider-Man. You grow into being a hero because it's something you work at. It's something you try. And then he tells him no refunds. And it's so perfectly Stan Lee, where on the one hand, yeah, he can absolutely give you this brilliant, uplifting, heart-wrenching speech, and then also remind you that you owe him some money. It's so perfect, and I just started bawling in the theater. And I'm someone, when I go to the movies, I don't like anybody to make any sound. I don't want to hear you talk. I don't want to hear you sing. I don't want to hear you cough. I don't care if you've got a kid and that kid starts screaming. You take that kid out back and you put it down. Like, I'm here to see a movie and experience something. I'm not here because you can't keep your crap under control. And suddenly I couldn't keep my crap under control. I legitimately almost left the theater to like go to the bathroom because I knew I couldn't keep it under wraps very well. And I amazingly did. I just covered my eyes, and it was just like, on the one hand, it was exactly what I needed to hear. And on the other hand, it was such a, like, someone just punched me in a wound that had just started to heal, and it just hurt. And that was one of those moments that really kind of cemented how important Stan was to me and how much I missed him. And yeah, like, you know, what else can I say? What else needs to be said? Like, on the one hand, I feel like I could never stop talking about how I feel about Stan and his impact on the comic book industry and how I've processed it or failed to process it. You know, while I tried to give you as good a breakdown as I could have, there's some stuff that I left out just because it doesn't particularly tell into Stan's narrative. I didn't talk much about his daughter, and to be fair, his daughter doesn't do a lot of anything involved with the comic book industry, but I mean, she is a part of Stan's legacy. She is still alive, and she is producing movies, and she is doing her own stuff, and she has her own beefs with Marvel or Disney because of the way they treated Stan, which I think is kind of a symptom of how these larger companies interact with comic books to begin with, and fail to do so in a way that mirrors, to me, kind of the way Stan treated guys like Jack Kirby and Ditko. And that's not even just, again, I'm not trying to demonize Stan. I'm just trying to say Steve Ditko and Jack Kirby clearly felt slighted for a reason, and we may never know those reasons. They've both sadly passed, so we'll probably never know those reasons. But those reasons existed. Something was there that was never explained. And so again, there's a legitimacy to that. But I don't think that there's anything else that I can say. I'm not a master of the written language like Stan was. I'm not nearly as good at alliteration as he is, that's for sure. So I think I'm just going to quote Stan one last time. But before I do that, I'd like to thank you for your time. If you're listening to this episode, then you're a subscriber, and I would like to thank you for taking the time to subscribe and the money to subscribe. I know it's not easy to choose to give somebody else money to do anything, and especially something like a podcast. But I really do appreciate it. Getting to kind of explore this background for Stan was super fascinating to me. I learned so much stuff that I had never heard before, that I'd never had any kind of concept of before. And it's just such a fascinating background to Stan and to comic books in general. And it's really been a blast getting to do this. And I'm looking forward to doing it for other comic book creators and hopefully having the opportunity to share another piece of the industry with you guys that a lot of people don't get to focus on. So thank you. And otherwise, I'm going to leave us with some very nice, simple words from the man himself. Nuff said. Welcome to the end of this episode of Breakdown Biographies, and thank you so much for doing so. I know that times are hard these days, and choosing where your money goes isn't an easy decision. And if you've decided to support Breakdown, well, words cannot convey how honored I am. Hopefully you enjoyed this episode on Stan Lee, because I know that I had a blast researching it. That was something that I wasn't expecting going into this. I really wasn't. I figured that this would just be a quick jaunt through some biographies, read a few internet interviews, and I'd be done, slap it all together, here's an episode, no big deal. But no, there was so much more for me to learn, and there were so many cool stories about him that I had never heard before. I've recently fallen in love with the old live-action Addams Family TV show, and every time that I watch it, I'm amazed that Stan knew Charles Addams. That's just so cool. And it's something that I had never heard before. I'm honestly still flabbergasted by it, like, clearly. My intent with Breakdown Biographies is to stroll through the history of the comics industry overall. For the most part, these will obviously be biographies, hence the name, but I hope to eventually cover the history of the companies themselves. Those would be much more broad strokes in their scope, or perhaps a streak of episodes like Breakdown sometimes does, but that's a lot to look into right now. Marvel and DC alone have like 80 plus years of history between them, so for now, I'm just gonna keep things focused on the people who made these comics and characters that we love. Since we've covered Stan Lee, I would be terribly remiss if I didn't next cover his frequent co-creator, a man who redefined what comic books could look like. A man whose artwork ended up changing the industry forever. Next month on Breakdown Biographies, please join me as I detail the life of Jack the King Kirby. And thank you